A new type of edible fat was invented by industrial machinery. It entered the food supply through processed goods, then home kitchens. The biological consequences took decades to become visible. This was not an isolated shift in how food was made. That changed in the late 19th century, not because of a scientific breakthrough in nutrition, not because anyone demonstrated a need for it, but because the technology to produce it finally existed, and once it did, the economic logic became irresistible. Factories had been built, supply chains had been established, markets had been identified. The ingredient didn't emerge from kitchens or farms, it emerged from the capabilities of industrial machinery, and once it could be made cheaply and in volume, it began appearing everywhere. At the time, this was considered progress. The ability to refine, isolate, and concentrate was seen as evidence of advancement. Purity was conflated with superiority. The idea that removing context from a substance might also remove something essential wasn't part of the conversation. What mattered was shelf life, consistency, and cost. The ingredient could be produced year-round regardless of season. It didn't spoil easily. It could be transported across continents without degradation. These were not trivial advantages in an era obsessed with logistics and scale. This wasn't introduced through dramatic announcements or public campaigns. It simply began replacing what had been used before, quietly, gradually, in processed goods first, then in home kitchens. The transition was framed as convenience, as modernization, as liberation from the inefficiencies of traditional methods. And because the change happened across so many products simultaneously, it became difficult to track. One ingredient swapped for another, one oil for a different oil, one fat for a refined alternative. The cumulative effect was invisible at the individual level, but decisive at the population level. Most people didn't question it. Why would they? The food still looked the same, it still tasted familiar or close enough, and it was cheaper, which mattered. The companies producing it were the same companies people had come to trust. The branding was consistent, the packaging was professional. The ingredient appeared in products made by recognizable names, sold in familiar stores, consumed by millions without incident. There was no obvious reason to be suspicious. It blended into everyday life, not because it was hidden, but because it was presented as normal.
This wasn't discussed openly, not in the way that new medicines or regulations might be debated. There were no public hearings, no widespread coverage in newspapers asking whether this shift was advisable. The decision-making happened in boardrooms and production facilities, driven by the economics of manufacturing, not by any collective consideration of long-term effects. The ingredient was legal, it was profitable, it was scalable. That was enough. It seemed too small to matter back then. After all, it was just one component among many, just one change in a food system undergoing dozens of changes simultaneously. Mechanization was transforming agriculture, refrigeration was altering distribution, packaging was extending product lifespans. Against that backdrop, the substitution of one fat or oil for another barely registered as noteworthy. It was treated as a technical detail, not a cultural or biological shift. And because it arrived alongside so many other innovations, it became difficult to isolate its specific role in what came later. The real impact appeared years later, not immediately, not in a way that could be traced back to a single ingredient with certainty, but patterns began to emerge. Patterns in metabolism, patterns in inflammation, patterns in chronic conditions that had been rare and were now becoming common. The human body, it turned out, responds differently to substances depending on their structure, their origin, their context. And the industrial process that made this ingredient possible also altered it in ways that weren't visible on a nutrition label. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. An entire generation had grown up consuming this ingredient daily, often multiple times per day, without knowing it. It had become embedded in the architecture of the food supply, Removing it would have required dismantling entire production systems, reformulating thousands of products, retraining consumers to accept different textures, different flavors, different prices. The inertia was enormous, and so the ingredient remained, even as evidence accumulated that it might not be as neutral as it had been assumed to be. This wasn't the result of malice, it was the result of a system optimized for efficiency, not for biological compatibility. The factories that produced this ingredient were doing exactly what they were designed to do: convert raw materials into shelf-stable, profitable products. The companies that used it were responding to market pressures: reduce costs, extend freshness, maintain consistency. The consumers who bought it were acting rationally within the options available to them. No individual decision was irrational, but the aggregate outcome was a food system increasingly disconnected from the conditions under which human metabolism had evolved.
The ingredient in question is vegetable oil, not the oil pressed from olives in small batches, used sparingly in traditional diets for centuries. Not the oil rendered from animal fats, which had been part of human nutrition for millennia, but industrially extracted and refined seed oils: corn oil, soybean oil, cottonseed oil, canola oil, sunflower oil. Oils that require heat, chemical solvents, and deodorization to become palatable. Oils that didn't exist in any meaningful quantity until the machinery to process them was invented. Before the 20th century, these oils were either unavailable or used exclusively for industrial purposes. Cottonseed oil, for example, was considered a waste product of cotton production. It was used in lamps, in soap, in machinery lubricants. The idea of consuming it was not seriously considered until the development of hydrogenation made it possible to solidify it into a butter substitute. Soybean oil followed a similar trajectory. Soybeans were grown primarily for animal feed and industrial applications. Extracting oil from them required crushing and heating under conditions that would have been impossible outside a factory setting. And yet, by the mid-20th century, these oils had become dominant in the American diet. This transformation was driven by a convergence of economic and technological factors. The rise of industrial agriculture created massive surpluses of corn and soybeans. Processors needed ways to monetize these surpluses. Oil extraction was one answer. At the same time, public health authorities were beginning to discourage the consumption of saturated fats based on emerging but incomplete theories about heart disease. Vegetable oils, being high in polyunsaturated fats, were positioned as healthier alternatives. The science behind this recommendation was disputed even at the time, but the narrative was simple, and it aligned with industrial interests. The marketing was effective. Vegetable oils were presented as clean, modern, scientifically validated. They were associated with images of lightness, purity, and vitality. Butter and lard, by contrast, were framed as old-fashioned, heavy, artery-clogging. The fact that humans had been consuming animal fats without widespread heart disease for thousands of years was not part of the public conversation. Neither was the fact that the processing methods used to produce vegetable oils generated trans fats and oxidized lipids, compounds with their own set of biochemical consequences. The shift happened quickly. Between 1910 and 1970, the consumption of soybean oil in the United States increased more than 1,000-fold. By the end of the century, seed oils accounted for a majority of the fat in the average American diet. This was unprecedented in human history. No population had ever consumed polyunsaturated fats at this scale from these sources, processed in this way. And yet it was treated as unremarkable, as the default, as what food had always been. The consequences were not immediately visible. Oil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't have a strong flavor once refined. It integrates seamlessly into baked goods, fried foods, salad dressings, margarine, mayonnaise, snack foods, prepared meals. It became the invisible foundation of processed food, present in nearly everything that came in a package. And because it was everywhere, it became difficult to study in isolation. How do you measure the effect of an ingredient when the control group, people who don't consume it, barely exists?
But patterns did emerge. Rates of obesity began to climb in the 1970s and 1980s, not uniformly but noticeably. Rates of type 2 diabetes followed. Then metabolic syndrome. Then non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Then a cluster of inflammatory and autoimmune conditions that had been rare and were now common. None of these conditions could be attributed to a single cause. They were multifactorial. But seed oils were present in nearly every case, not as the only variable, but as a constant one. Research into the biological mechanisms began to accumulate slowly. Polyunsaturated fats, it turns out, are chemically unstable. They oxidize easily when exposed to heat, light, or oxygen. And the industrial refining process involves all three. The oils are heated to high temperatures. They're treated with chemical solvents like hexane. They're bleached and deodorized to remove the rancid smell that develops during extraction. The final product is shelf-stable and neutral tasting, but it's also molecularly altered in ways that affect how the body processes it. When consumed in large quantities, these oils change the composition of cell membranes. They alter the balance of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, tipping it heavily toward omega-6. This shift has downstream effects on inflammation, on immune function, on signaling pathways that regulate metabolism. It doesn't happen overnight, it accumulates over years, over decades. And because the effects are diffuse and delayed, they're difficult to link back to a specific dietary change that happened 50 years earlier.
This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a cascade. One decision led to another. The invention of oil extraction technology made seed oils possible. The surplus production of soybeans and corn made them cheap. The campaign against saturated fat made them recommended. The economics of food manufacturing made them ubiquitous. And the absence of long-term epidemiological data made the risks invisible until it was too late to reverse course without massive disruption. The people who introduced these oils into the food supply were not trying to harm anyone. They were solving problems: how to feed more people, how to reduce costs, how to extend shelf life, how to respond to public health guidance. The problem was that the guidance was premature, the science was incomplete, the feedback loops were too slow. By the time the data became clear, the ingredient was already foundational. And it still is. Walk into any supermarket and try to find packaged foods that don't contain soybean oil, canola oil, or sunflower oil. Try to find a restaurant that doesn't fry in vegetable oil. Try to find a salad dressing, a cracker, a granola bar, a frozen meal that uses butter or olive oil instead. You'll find a few, but they'll be expensive, they'll be niche, they'll be marketed as specialty products, even though they're closer to what food was before industrialization.
The default has shifted. What was once normal, cooking with animal fats, using butter, eating whole foods that hadn't been stripped and reassembled, now requires deliberate effort. It requires rejecting convenience. It requires spending more money. It requires going against the grain of a food system that has been built over the course of a century to prioritize shelf stability and profit margins over biological compatibility. This is not a story about individual failure. It's not about people making bad choices. It's about a structural transformation that happened largely without public input, driven by technological capability and economic incentive, justified by incomplete science, and normalized through repetition. The ingredient didn't become dominant because it was better for human health.
It became dominant because it was better for industrial food production. And this wasn't the only change. Similar decisions followed. Similar patterns repeated. The logic that made seed oils ubiquitous was the same logic that introduced high-fructose corn syrup, that replaced whole grains with refined flour, that added sugar to products that didn't need it, that engineered foods to be hyper-palatable rather than nourishing. Each change was small. Each change was justified. Each change made economic sense in isolation. But the cumulative effect was a food system that stopped resembling food as it had been understood for most of human history. And the bodies that evolved to process that older form of food were left to adapt, or fail to adapt, to the new one. The consequences are still unfolding. The ingredient is still everywhere, and the conversation about whether it should be is still, for the most part, not happening. That pattern didn't stop there.